You are about to take part in a time-traveling road trip through pop culture. A road trip with a clear destination and many stops along the way. This is but one act of one chapter of the serialized journey.
So if any of you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance to, well, we've warned you.
These people will be exploring issues that are teens' issues.
Right out of the gate.
We're doing pretty good, huh?
Hey there, guess who's back? It's me! I'm back. Why has it taken so long for the Coolness Chronicles to return, no one asked? I've had some health issues, a death in the family, and other stuff you don't want or need to know about. Going forward, starting with this new chapter, the podcast is going to be structured a little differently. The most important difference is something that expands on an idea that we occasionally played with in previous episodes. We'll be taking periodic pauses in this narrative of MST3K to do what I call detours. Deep dives into movies and TV shows that I was either introduced to or inspired to revisit by the show, and these deep dives will help provide some context or just allow us to experience some tangential deep hurting. I can't only talk about my favorite puppet show all day, after all, and I hope you enjoy the new normal. When we last left off, creator Joel Hodgson departed the series in the middle of the 5th season after years of feuding with fellow executive producer Jim Mallon. Joel's character was written out of the show with episode 512, Mitchell, having escaped from the Satellite of Love in an escape pod. And an unwitting Deep 13 auditing intern named Mike Nelson was being sized up for a jumpsuit to take his place in the same experiment. This week, we pick up right where we left off in Chapter 7 and discuss exactly how and why MST3K changed with the new status quo, beginning our trip through what I believe are the best years of the show, the Age of Mike. As always, I am Ryan Rodriguez, and you are stuck with the Coolness Chronicles Season 1, The History and Legacy of Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Tonight's episode.
Chapter 8, A Smooth Transition. Act 1, The Buddy Dynamic. So, what happens when the main source of the identity of a television show cuts ties and leaves? In a weaker show with a weaker cast and a weaker staff, implosion is usually the end result. But Mystery Science Theater 3000 was not a weak show. It was a show that, even in its 5th season, was still growing and evolving. As a host and riffer, creator Joel Hodgson was becoming more polished and focused, and co-stars Trace Beaulieu and Kevin Murphy had long become equal-status co-stars and accomplished puppeteers in their own right. The day-to-day writing staff, consisting of Hodgson, Beaulieu, Murphy, producer Jim Mallon, Frank Conniff, Paul Chaplin, Bridget Jones, Mary Jo Pehl, and head writer Michael J. Nelson, was functioning as a cohesive unit, completely in tune with each other's sensibilities and building on them. But change was inevitable, and now that Joel was gone, the show would go on with a new host. With a new host came a new tone, a new identity, and new ambitions. The staff at Best Brains held auditions for potential hosts during the time of Joel's final few episodes, but the general consensus was that Mike Nelson, who had appeared in most episodes throughout the first 5 seasons as various characters from the experiments, was a natural replacement. Even before Joel decided to leave, Jim Mallon had already been lobbying to find Mike a more permanent on-camera role. As we addressed in the previous chapter, Joel's original concept for his replacement involved Bridget playing a female version of himself, a way of trying to avoid a direct comparison between hosts that could have worked based on Bridget's charm alone, but would have certainly been problematic in terms of gender politics. Although the final decision to promote Mike was made after Joel had one foot completely out the door, he conceded that, although they were setting themselves up for a Dick York, Dick Sargent split in the fanbase, which is of course absurd and never came to pass, exchanging a creator for the head writer was an even trade. What exactly changed? Well, everything and nothing. Nothing in the sense that the premise of the show, a man and his robot companions forced to watch bad movies by 2 subterranean mad scientists, was as concrete as it ever got. everything in the sense that aesthetic retooling was in order to keep the show fresh and tailor certain elements to Mike's strengths. The invention exchange, a hallmark of the Joel era that was born out of his stand-up act, didn't fit Mike's character, who was more of an amiable, put-upon everyman, as opposed to Joel Robinson, the gearhead. This segment was gradually phased out during Mike's first 12-episode run, the first few of which featured some genuinely interesting inventions like an umbrella with a built-in gutter system or fridge udders, which allowed the inventor to essentially milk their fridge through synthetic teats.
It comes with 4 teats.
Teats. Wow, we can say that too.
This one over here, regular milk.
By the 20th episode of the season, Radar Secret Service, the inventions were exclusive to Dr. Forrester and Frank way down in Deep 13, and the airtime usually reserved for inventions on the Satellite of Love was freed up for an additional host segment, something that, in future seasons, would provide more time to craft an episode-long story threaded through the breaks in the movie. And speaking of stories, until the Sci-Fi Channel era, which was for a time serialized, this new era presented its own kind of recurring concept, and that's Mike's desperate attempts to escape his predicament. Unlike Joel, who seemed to accept and appreciate his life on the SOL, Mike was always trying to find a way to end his torment, always to no avail. He manages to get a hold of numerous family members on the phone, only to have his efforts dashed as if by fate. In other episodes, he tries creating a rope of sheets to climb his way down to Earth, only to be admonished by Crow, whose underoos he had to shred in order to make the rope long enough. If Joel was a resident on the satellite, Mike was undoubtedly a prisoner. Joel's departure also necessitated some changes to the set, as Joel took the name Gizmonic Institute with him. The trademark Gizmonic G logo on the door in the hallway sequence was filled in, creating a cog split in two that would come together when the doors were closed. This design element would last until the end of the Comedy Central era. And since the Institute was no longer a part of the show's narrative, the commercial break interstitials depicting the Gizmonic campus shown during the opening credits were replaced by tracking shots of previously unseen areas of Forrester's lab, with the experiment number and name illustrated on a blackboard, various beakers of unknown material, and a logbook, respectively. These little redesigns also manifested in some alterations to the bridge of the SOL, reflecting the increasing ambition of the cast and crew, as well as a completely new doorway sequence, as the original Joel-era sequence had not held up well over time. This new sequence, designed by Trace and Jeff Maynard and built by Jeff and Sci-Fi era production designer and future Gypsy, Patrick Brantzig, included operating room drawers, a drawbridge, tiny video screens, an animated mouse scurrying across the floor, which, until I read the official MST3K wiki, I was certain was a roach, and a brand new hatch that appears to unlock itself. Of course, with a new host and new set elements, the show completes its makeover trifecta with a brand new opening credits sequence and a remix of the theme song, sung by Mike himself.
In a not too distant future, way down in Deep 13, Dr. Forrester and TV's Frank were hatching an evil scheme. They hired a temp by the name of Mike, just a regular Joe they didn't like. Their experiment needed a good test case, so they conked him on the noggin and they shot him into space. We'll send him cheesy movies, the worst we can find. He'll have to sit and watch them all, and we'll monitor his mind. Now keep in mind, Mike can't control where the movies begin or end. He'll try to keep his sanity with the help of his robot friends.
Robot roll call Cabot. Gypsy. Tom Servo. Crow.
If you're wondering how he eats and breathes and other science facts, just repeat to yourself, it's just a show. I should really just relax. For Mystery Science Theater 3000.
As I mentioned at the start of this chapter, I generally regard The Age of Mike, which began the week after The Age of Joel, on October 30th, 1993, as the greatest era of the show. Sidebar. I'm going to take a few minutes to compare Mike and Joel as hosts, and it's going to seem like I'm dumping on Joel. I'm not. I'm merely inviting comparison between two distinct periods of the show. If I compliment Mike on a particular aspect of the job, I'm not saying that it's the only way to do that job. I have a personal preference, but this podcast is meant for people on both sides of the host debate, as well as people that don't even feel that there is a debate. Every perspective is welcome. End sidebar. There are elements from the Joel age that I miss in this particular era, especially the father-son relationship between Joel and his bots, but it's simply just a matter of interior logic that this kind of characterization couldn't continue without him. Unless the crew were to retcon the origin of the bots, they would only have the one parental unit, and because they wouldn't bring up said unit very frequently in order to avoid being distracting and to give Mike room to breathe as a performer and a character, the show was simply unable to retain all of its former charm, so they had to come up with some fresh charm. Mike's relationship with Crow and Servo alternated between adversarial, usually whenever Mike tried to get anything done, which always brought about rebellion and obstinance, and fraternal. This dynamic, which probably provided the most amount of great observant comedy, frequently depicted the bots looking down at Mike as if his presence was an impediment to their daily routine, like they had been alone without their creator for years before Mike landed on the satellite and had gotten along just fine. Alternately, if Mike were trying to be productive or helpful to the atmosphere in the SOL, the bots, Gypsy aside, would intentionally or not turn the proceedings into utter anarchy. What I enjoy most about these interactions is that it actually mirrors the production of the show. Trace and Kevin were, in fact, on the satellite for an entire season at KTMA before Mike joined the writing staff, giving them seniority as shareholders and best brains. Sometimes I wonder if, during these early Mike episodes, the writers were consciously referencing this hierarchy, or if it just came organically in a let's prank the new guy fashion. Mike, as a host, is also an upgrade from the Joel era, where Joel had his niches and unmistakable delivery that was wholly his own and almost impossible to duplicate. He was still very lethargic and quirky, always feeling like he was playing a version of himself. Joel is a performer, where Mike, on the other hand, is actually an actor. He can do characters, he can do a wide range of voices, and he can sing, not as well as Kevin, but still professionally. Joel was also very loose with his delivery, which gave his era more of a shaggy dog quality, often continuing takes after he flubbed a line or missed a dialogue cue, but Mike was more professional and exact. If he laughed at Trace or Kevin in the middle of a take, it felt natural but not derailing, and simply added to the atmosphere. This is best encapsulated in the letter reading segments, where it seems like he's genuinely on one track trying to get through the segment, only to be thrown off his axis by the bots, which he promptly runs with. They're segments that feel both carefully calculated and completely spontaneous, and that's not an easy balance to achieve. Also, unlike the first few seasons of the show, which underwent sudden cast changes and took some time to find its footing both in the theater and out, the transition from Joel to Mike was virtually seamless. Mike had been with the show since they made the move to cable, so he'd been riffing with Kevin and Trace since the theater segments were scripted. We just never got to see it until he stepped onto the set. There wouldn't be a true transition period again until the sci-fi era, but again, we'll get to that in time. While Joel's era can't necessarily be pegged as safe, it was risque at times and definitely leaned into edginess when appropriate, but it was definitely more of a family-friendly show than that of Mike's years. The cast and crew would frequently note that parents would watch the show with their children, and many of the letters read at the end of every episode would come from kids, sometimes as young as 5 years old, and the show, as a result, skewed younger. The Mike era leaned into the darker side of riffing possibilities, both in the content chosen to be riffed and the actual riffs themselves. As early as Mike's second episode, the cast and crew began to behave almost liberated in the theater, as evidenced by this intro to that episode's short, Is This Love?
Is this love, or is it just rough sex with Michael Douglas?
Wow.
As I see it, this moment is a microcosm of the new era, especially notable in Mike's reaction to the riff, which implies that he too is taken aback by Servo. This is a moment that tells the audience, Dad isn't here anymore, and we don't have to be so polite. It opens the door to a more scathing take-no-prisoners approach in the future, without sacrificing the show's palpable soul. The show's heart is still there, beating like always, but it's coated in a sarcastic shell. It's the dividing line in the sand between two distinct approaches to the material. Had the show continued with Joel, I don't think we would have gotten experiments like Outlaw, The Violent Years, The Sinister Urge, Racket Girls, High School Big Shot, Angel's Revenge, or The Incredible Melting Man, just to name a few. The nihilism of Coleman Francis might have remained undiscovered. Of Of course, whether or not that's a good thing depends entirely on your perspective. All I know is this: if the show had to change, I'm grateful that that change was Mike. There are so many more things that I'm looking more forward to discussing in the next 2 seasons than the entire history of the show thus far. So let's get to the awesomeness, shall we? We're eventually going to cover events in a non-linear fashion, just like before, but before we break chronology, let's discuss Mike's first few experiments, starting with the one that would serve as a visual reference in the opening credits for 2 whole seasons. A film produced in 1959, but, due to red tape and some censorship issues, was released in 1962. The Brain That Wouldn't Die.
You've lost the urge to experiment.
Oh, every time you touch me, I go out of my mind. Let me die. Let me die.
Her brain kept alive by experimental science, by a man whose abnormal passions inspired him to try the impossible.
I brought her back. She'll live and I'll get her another body.
Yes, and what of her soul? How can you make of her an experiment of horror?
This movie follows the exploits of Bill, an unscrupulous mad scientist, as if there are any other kinds, who works as a surgeon with his father during the day and perfects a process of limb transplantation by night. He also uses his dad's country home as a clandestine perverted playground, which seems to only mildly annoy Pops, and has made a regular habit of stealing spare body parts from the morgue, which registers only deep disappointment from dear old Dad. If only every deviant who tampered in God's domain had parents like Bill. Anyway, Bill gets an important call from his faithful assistant Kurt and races off to the limb shack with his fiancée, Nurse Jan, in tow. Bill makes one grave mistake, however, and that's his decision to drive at Doctor Strange speeds around sharp curves, leading to a fiery car wreck. Bill is thrown completely clear, escaping even the most minor of scratches, but Jan is trapped in the twisted wreckage. Thinking on his feet, or his back, which he landed on, Bill rushes to the car and wraps up as much as what's left of Jan in his jacket as he possibly can. And what's left of Jan to wrap up? I direct you back to the title of the film.
Is that what? Oh.
Oh, that's her head.
Oh, yuck.
Don't forget my purse, honey. The rest of it's pretty crispy.
Well, you just had to go fast, didn't you? Well, look, Mr. Big Shot, now I don't have a body anymore. Are you happy?
When Bill finally makes it to the spare parts cottage, he manages to slap together an extremely complicated and revolutionary support system for Jan's head in the basement, including a pan with a shallow layer of neck juice, which he hypothesizes will keep the head alive and functional for at least 50 hours, giving him enough time to secure a compatible body for transplantation. Jan slowly begins to regain consciousness and speak as Kurt questions Bill's medical logic. Kurt also reveals that he was the subject of an unsuccessful transplant courtesy of Bill, resulting in a withering, decayed arm. Sidebar: how Jan's head, even with the groundbreaking pan and other assorted fake medical bullshit, can speak and breathe despite being severed from the very lungs that are responsible for such basic functions is beyond me. I just don't question it, and neither should you. End sidebar. To make an 82-minute short story even shorter, Bill spends most of the movie's runtime outside the lab, prowling a burlesque nightclub and a beauty contest mostly consisting of women whom the director of the movie owed favors to, as well as driving around to suburban streets in the daytime like the potential kidnapper he is.
About to call a cop the way you were looking me over. How have you been, Bill?
Oh, just fine, Donna. I haven't seen you for quite a while.
Too long. I'm still waiting for that call you once promised me.
You know how it is with interns. All work.
All work and no play even makes for dull doctors. You're gonna lose that bedside manner of yours.
Yeah, right. Would you mind if I cut your head off?
These activities eventually lead to dead ends, until Bill recounts an old flame named Doris, who is terribly self-conscious because of a nasty scar on her cheek. Considering the scores of sweaty, gross photographers she models bikinis for in her living room, the scar clearly is an impediment to her career, but it's still a really sore point. Bill the sociopath plays on poor Doris's insecurities and promises to take care of the scar and make her beautiful again, even though it's easily covered by her hair. and brings her to the lab in order to drug her and prep her body for surgery.
Why should you want to do this for me? What's in it for you?
Meanwhile, Jan's time in the pan plunges her into the depths of suicidal despair, and she wonders aloud why Bill or Kurt couldn't just let her die with some semblance of dignity. Because when I think of fun, schlocky exploitation horror, I think of existential misery and euthanasia. She also acquires pseudo-telepathy, possibly a side effect of the neck juices, and begins psychically communicating with some kind of hideous monster locked in Bill's closet/dungeon. This monster, through a hatch in the closet door, manages to get a hold of Kurt's bum arm and rips it clean off, causing Kurt to stumble all over the death shack, smearing blood on the walls and calling attention to the fact that the actor's actual arm is clearly tied to his side beneath the special effects makeup. Bill brings the unconscious Doris to the basement, but pauses to slowly back up to the closet door, which shockingly pops open to reveal a pin-headed monster, played by Barnum and Bailey's Jewish giant Eddie Carmel. The monster strangles Bill a bit, then pulls a page right out of the Jack Bauer handbook and rips out his throat with his teeth. He also accidentally sets the basement ablaze and carries Doris to safety as Jan, in her pan, cackles with devilish glee and gives the camera a good look at exactly how this makeup is applied.
Look at that. The mask is just tied in the back.
It's nothing we haven't seen before, Mike.
It's got a soggy butt.
The brain that wouldn't die is a perfect kind of middle-of-the-road terrible that makes her the ideal first experiment for Mike's tenure as host. It's not the worst movie ever featured on the show up to that point, nor is it close to the best. It was shot in 13 days, which is evident by the production's lack of sets and general lack of effort in terms of special effects consistency and perfunctory performances. And rushed cinematography results in the occasional close-up of the actor who plays Dr. Bill, in which the grayness of the background appears to project him into a neutral space unrelated to whatever scene he's in.
Help me, I'm in another dimension!
Help me, I'm still here. I can't get out.
In terms of the episode built around the movie, this is a particularly strong effort, tweaking the show's mythos, building on Mike's character after the cleverly seeded introduction in Mitchell, and offering plenty of opportunities for the bots to assert their new status quo. The episode's prologue features Crow and Servo putting Mike through riff training, which feels like a conscious effort on behalf of the Best Brains crew to reassure any doubting fans that the show they love is indeed changing, but not to an extreme degree.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike. Welcome to the Satellite of Love and this week's experiment. I'm a little out of breath. Just hold on a second. The bots have been running me through a heap of bad movies, kind of in training for this week's actual experiment.
Come on, Mike. We haven't got all day. The proverbial hour is nigh, if you know what I mean.
I know training's been a little rigorous on you, new boy, but dig down deep, buddy.
Yeah, because compared to today's experiment, the Beast of Yucca Flat was just a cakewalk.
I only hope I can do it.
Buck up, new meat.
Thanks, Tom.
That's Crow.
Right.
Look, you quipped your way through Night of the Lepus, but this is the real thing, son. This is the big time.
Sid Melton. Answer is?
Little Monkey Boy.
Bravo,
Mr. Nielsen.
It's Nelson.
And we'll be right back.
Is that my line?
Don't push it.
Sorry.
Fun fact. The Beast of Yucca Flats would eventually be riffed towards the end of the next season, and Mike and Kevin, along with future Crow Bill Corbett, would tackle Night of the Lepus for riff tracks in 2014. The episode also features a key piece of information that has puzzled Misties for years. Why does Servo have to be carried into the theater when he can clearly hover around the rest of the satellite whenever he pleases? Thankfully, Crow is there to provide the answer when Mike makes the mistake of entering the theater without Tom in tow.
Mike, you gotta bring Tom in.
Why?
Because he can't hover. There's an air grate there.
Oh, God. I'll get him. Sorry, buddy.
You're missing the movie.
Sorry.
That's so humiliating my life.
I didn't know. How could I...
The riffs are on point throughout the experiment, which should be expected given the writing staff assembled by this time, including a movie reference that serves as this podcast's first official detour. As I mentioned earlier in this week's introduction, the research process for the second half of this season took about 10 times longer than the first half because I decided to indulge in an experiment. If you recall my previous tangents on Mannix or McCloud, I occasionally paused the narrative to discuss films and television shows that I was introduced to by MST3K. Well, this time around, I decided to condense these segments and sprinkle them throughout each season, taking the time to watch and review shows and films based on references made in the theater or in the host segments. Sometimes I was rewatching something with a new perspective, sometimes I was discovering a classic for the first time, but usually I was subjecting myself to the deepest of deep hurting. Since this podcast is only going to survive in future seasons if I diversify the subjects discussed and take a conversation in a new, unexpected direction, I figured the best way to test out such diversions, or detours if you will, was through a mystery science lens. I knew it was a decent idea when I began viewing my first detour, which was referenced around the 56-minute mark of the brain that wouldn't die, particularly when Dr. Bill is trying to pick up women off the street for body transplants.
Well, as a matter of fact, I can wait. Now that there's two of you, we'll have to wait.
Guess he thinks there's safety in numbers.
Well, this time there is.
He promised not to hurt you.
And I promise not to hurt you.
Have you seen Frankenhooker?
So let's pause this road trip through pop culture history and travel to 1990 to discuss Frank Henenlotter's Frankenhooker.
The world was horrified by the motion picture Frankenstein. In 1935, horror turned to terror with The Bride of Frankenstein. In 1990, the makers of Basket Case and Brain Damage bring you...
Want a date?
Frankenhooker. Jeffrey Franken has a plan.
I just want to bring you back.
He has the ingenuity.
I need female body parts.
He has everything he needs, except the raw materials.
Just hold still. Excellent. Oh, my God. Onion!
Wow! Jeffrey's creation is alive.
Looking for some action?
Oh, yeah.
She's sexy.
Want a date? You going out?
I'm on my way home, but thanks anyway.
And she's sutured to please.
Listen, I'm looking for a very tall, attractive woman. She's purple. She's got fresh stars on her. She's in the bar.
Now, a motion picture like no other. A tender story of love and romance.
Want a date?
A gripping tale of lust and revenge. Frankenhooker.
Incredible.
Some assembly may be required.
This movie's boldness starts with its poster tagline, A Tale of Sluts and Bolts. It's a tagline that says, you may not like this movie, but you certainly won't forget it anytime soon. Let's lay out the story. Imagine Victor Frankenstein is a science nerd schlub in suburban New Jersey at the beginning of the 90s.
What began as a birthday barbecue ended in a bizarre tragedy in Hohokus, New Jersey today. It was this power mower that brought a quick end to the life of 21-year-old bride-to-be Elizabeth Shelley. Like wood through a mulcher, the girthful fiancée disappeared beneath the blades of the berserk mower that sent her personality raining down upon the horrified birthday revelers. In a blaze of blood, bones, and body parts, the vivacious young girl was instantly reduced to a tossed human salad, a salad that police are still trying to gather up, a salad that was once named Elizabeth. But death by lawnmower is not the end of the strange twist in this case.
Of course, it's hard to be real specific at this point, but yes, apparently parts of her are missing.
Do you know which parts or how many?
Like I said, it's hard to be real specific at this point. She's just one big jigsaw puzzle.
Jigsaw puzzle?
Jigsaw puzzle.
What's a guy to do? Well, the Frankenstein proxy in this story, Jeffrey Franken, has a brilliant idea. Preserve as many parts of his fiancée as he can, especially her head, create a strain of exploding crack, and prowl 42nd Street looking for prostitutes to detonate and cobble together for a new patchwork surrogate body. Along the way, he runs afoul of an evil pimp in Zubaz named Zorro because, as I've stated twice before, it's the 90s, and eventually reassembles his fiancée into a zombie streetwalker who promptly escapes, barreling headfirst into the scummy VD-ridden New York that would soon disappear under the reign of Giuliani for a darkly funny and frequently disgusting homage to both the original Frankenstein novel, the series of Universal monster movies, and, amazingly enough, The Brain That Wouldn't Die, which was apparently the main genesis for the concept. It's a film that, while I watched it, I felt alternately perverted and utterly entertained, which I suppose is a compliment in its own way. Frank Henenlotter has always been a fascinating filmmaker with a very distinct point of view and a visual flourish that usually makes up for the most of whatever threadbare budget he's saddled with, from 1982's Basket Case to 1988's Brain Damage. I'd be hard-pressed to name another filmmaker that would make a film equal parts reverent and revolting, much less one that posed the question, what if the brain that wouldn't die were made by the higher-end wackos at Troma and were actually worth watching? It's a movie that frequently is very funny and never less than creative, and features Louise Lasser, of all people, in a very small but genuinely sweet role as Jeffrey's reserved, supported mother. I'm actually kind of grateful that MST3K steered me toward this film. If Frankenhooker was in any way indicative of the detours to come throughout the next few chapters of this podcast, we're going to discuss some weird shit, and that's never a bad thing in my eyes. Except for when the movie was terrible, in which case I'm still steaming. Mike's second episode, Experiment 514, is 1964's Teenage Strangler, a profoundly perfunctory movie with a wildly misleading title and one redeeming feature. But before we get to that feature, let's run through what we have to work with, starting with the plot. In a generic small town, someone or something, but most likely someone, as this is not a supernatural story, is clearly murdering teenage girls, and women too, so consistency is not this killer's forte. Lieutenant Anderson, the cynical cop assigned to the case, begins to suspect various local delinquents due to his believing that their parents are far too permissive and trusting. This suspicion is compounded when an eyewitness to a murder identifies the killer wearing a jacket emblazoned with the illustrated bulldog insignia of a juvenile drag racing gang, the Fastbacks. The shit truly hits the fan when a relatively placid fastback named Jimmy starts frequently leaving his house after curfew to carry on a dalliance with his operatic and shrill schoolmate Betty. Because this relationship is frowned upon by Jimmy's parents, he refuses to divulge his whereabouts on several occasions, each time coincidentally coinciding with fresh murders. Anderson's interest in the Fastbacks and Jimmy's lack of an alibi stirs up intrigue amongst the gang, leading to a fistfight between Jimmy and fellow gang member Curly and a climactic drag race with some suspicious sound effects.
It's Junior Car Rodeo with old-timer Billy Slater.
You can't squeal in dirt. It's impossible.
Maybe Hal Needham was brought in to direct this sequence.
Too good.
Stop that!
When Curly ends up in a poorly orchestrated crash, Jimmy and Betty notice that his jacket is conspicuously missing the aforementioned bulldog insignia, and Betty is sent to the high school to inspect Curly's locker. When she does so, she finds the bulldog, but her detective work is cut short by the creepy janitor, who is revealed to be the titular Strangler, which prevents more questions than it answers.
So I thought the Strangler was going to be a teenager, hence the title, Teenage Strangler.
Yeah, but he wasn't. He didn't exactly strangle teenagers because that one lady was older.
That's
so
right.
why the title Teenage Strangler?
Well, that exactly is my point. It's not
romantical
Teenage Strangler, or as it should be called, The Janitor Murders, is a standard painfully dull murder mystery / juvenile delinquency panic programmer. Visually, the color changes from shot to shot, which is a lighting issue, a composition issue, a film stock issue, and an entirely avoidable issue. The soundtrack consists of basically 2 songs played ad nauseum. First, a blatant attempt at a pop hit called Yipe Stripes that appears in 2 ways. By this record mode,
Z-Pile! Let's see your pantaloons again!
Thank you! The Mickey's Diners audiences are the greatest audiences in the world!
and suspenseful noir mode. Second, a familiar-sounding jazz track that plays over almost every minute not drowned out by Yipe Stripes, including strangling sequences and the aftermath of Curly's fateful crash, which Servo eventually identifies as too familiar.
And put some gas in it, too! And go backwards all the way! Trying to make it real compared to what?
None of it is particularly interesting or even entertaining, and you get the sense that, for the most part, this would have been a difficult experience for the writing staff. Right now, you might be saying to yourself, "But Ryan, I thought you said that there was at least one redeeming feature in this cinematic experience." And there certainly is, in the form of a godsend named Mikey, Jimmy's hyperventilating, effeminate, Eddie Dezonian little brother. Picture in your mind's eye a constantly gesticulating, diminutive Buddy Holly with a voice like a wilting southern belle, and you have a decent idea of the joy that is Mikey.
Hey, Mom.
What's
Mom,
that?
can I bring some of the kids over? Oh, hi, Jimmy. This afternoon, maybe we can do something.
Mikey, get upstairs.
Your brother is a killer.
I think we found Waldo.
What did I do?
Get upstairs.
You know the rules. How did you get unchained?
All right.
Now, anybody know him?
And leave Mikey alone.
He's working on his novel.
He enters the picture around the halfway point of the movie, and any time he's on screen, Mike and the bots get the potent riffing material that they truly deserve, transforming what would have been a slightly below average experiment into something truly memorable and truly mean.
Mistress Aisha, I'm here for my beating.
Okay, is home Betty? No. Oh, is available, but is Betty available? Oh, I don't know what the... Ah!
Is Betty home, Miss Royson? It's important, honest. I gotta talk to her.
Well, I'll see. You wait here.
You're safe, I guess.
If I could just smell a few cushions, I'd be happy.
You mean you don't know about Jimmy? What about Jimmy?
He's my brother.
He got arrested last night because he wasn't home. Another girl got killed, and he wasn't home, so they arrested him. I know he went home. He promised me. I know, but the police came just as he... Well, he got scared and drove off in Dad's car.
Don't hit me.
When they caught him, he said he couldn't tell where he was. He just couldn't. Oh, my gosh. He was with me. I know, but he won't tell them.
Mikey was immortalized by John Humphreys, who made his screen debut and final film performance here. Since Humphreys was aware that his co-star, Joe Canterbury, who played Betty, had been a quote-unquote professional actor off-Broadway, he emulated her line readings, even when he was in the same frame as her, as evidenced by his most memorable scene.
Come on, Betty.
We're very upset about the school lunch program.
Lieutenant Anderson.
That's me.
He didn't do it. He didn't do it. He was with me last night. The reason he didn't tell you was because he knew I'd get into trouble if my folks found out that I'd sneaked out. But he didn't do it, Lieutenant. He was with me. And he didn't steal no bike neither.
What?
I did. He just wanted to...
Good Lord, who is this clown?
Just calm down.
Mikey, and as a result Humphreys, was so beloved by cast, crew, and fans alike that he was one of the very special guests at the very first fan convention for MST3K in 1994, alongside Warrior the Lost World director David Worth and frequent Roger Corman collaborator and all-around Fox, Beverly Garland. Since Middle-Aged Custodian Killer only ran 61 minutes, it was coupled with the first short subject of the Mike era, Is This Love? This short is the origin of the clip that I played earlier in the episode involving rough sex and Michael Douglas, and tries to serve as a warning to boys and girls of marrying age to complete their schooling before considering nuptials. Much like the feature it accompanies, this is not a particularly classic short aside from the killer dividing line intro, but it does contain a genuinely interesting conclusion in two ways. Usually industrial shorts trying to force morals down juvenile throats, and with tragic cautionary twists of fate, or at least a plea for obedience. But Is This Love concludes with the main couple ignoring the sensible urgings of their friends and parents and driving off to get married before graduating, leaving the fate of their relationship relatively ambiguous, with the narrator asking the audience if their love will last without leaning either way. I know that doesn't sound particularly exciting, but as someone who has seen more than their fair share of conservative industrial shorts in the last few years alone, I can assure you that this is definitely an anomaly. And aside from this surprising twist, the short concludes with a list of follow-up shorts, one of which would eventually be tackled by riff tracks, and Mike and the bots take the premise and run with it, rattling off more riffs that definitely keep the new era premise going.
How much affection?
When should I marry?
Know your ointments.
What's that down there?
When he wants it rough.
Procreation, not recreation.
Oh no, pleasure.
McClintock.
The episode built around the short and feature is quite good, presenting a collection of host segments that could have made for a decent episode even without the divine presence of Mikey. The prologue features Mike's second attempt to escape the satellite of love, this time using his collection of calling cards to reach his grandmother on Earth via telephone, which naturally blows up in his face when he gets her answering machine, which promptly hangs up mid-message. This then leads Crow to try and be helpful, but failing and settling for being adorable.
Mike! You should really make a note of that you got a machine so that if the bill comes and we're erroneously charged for the call, then you have a paperwork to back up your claim that you were charged for the call in error so that you won't have to pay for that call, Mike.
Crow, you lived during the Great Depression, didn't you?
Oh, Backrack and David are calling.
They are?
Just push the button.
A later host segment, which I would play in its entirety if I didn't want to keep these episodes as short as I can, builds on the buddy dynamic between Mike and his new friends as Crow and Servo do their best gang member impersonations, and Mike tries to get through to their better angels with the tragically unhip dedication of a youth pastor. It's a sketch that doesn't really work in a non-visual medium, but it's worth tracking down if only to see Crow wearing high-top sneakers and Servo's tiny leather jacket. The next episode, the last for this week, may actually be the worst movie ever featured on the show through all 10 seasons. And yes, I'm considering Manos and the combined filmographies of Ed Wood, Coleman Francis, and Graydon Clark. A movie so bad that the cast and crew couldn't bear to write a single host segment about it, something so wretched that it broke Servo. I'm talking, of course, about Experiment 515, 1966, The Wild, Wild World of Batwoman.
Batwoman!
You may take your position, 14.
Thank you, Batwoman.
You have your instructions, Neon. Carry them out. Neon, you idiotic fool! What do you think you're doing?
You must have switched the glasses, Batwoman. I only wanted to show you how wonderful they are. I only wanted to make you happy.
That's where you make your mistake.
Batwoman was written and directed, if one can use those words properly, by Jerry Warren, a man whose IMDb biography identifies as a director who could, quote, be counted on through the late 50s and early 60s to deliver the lowest common denominator in horror, end quote, which feels like too kind of an assessment. This is not a movie. It has no beginning, middle, or end. It's just an amorphous blob that just so happens to be printed on celluloid. It's a collection of mincing, awful performances stitched together with bold chunks of copyright infringement, incompetence in front of and behind the camera, and some truly unpleasant racism masquerading as half-ass comedy. This is the story according to the internet. Quote, in this zero-budget cheapie, a busty Batwoman enlists her beauteous bevy of Batgirls, when they're not dancing the jerk, to help her regain a mad scientist's invention, an atom bomb made out of a hearing aid, before a costume ne'er-do-well, Ratfink, can glom onto it for his own purposes. End quote. Now, I will concede that there are indeed people randomly dancing in almost every frame, and I heard the names Ratfink and Batwoman a few times, but that synopsis is far too clean and succinct to accurately describe the experience. Plus, it implies that there's actually a point to the whole endeavor, which feels completely anathema to the final product. I've seen this episode about 10 or 12 times because there's something purely transgressive and immediate about it. Also, I hate myself. If this were unriffed and not broken up with sketches involving charming puppets, I would rather bleed out from my scrotum than ever watch another second of it. Typically, the MST3K crew has seen each experiment at least 8 times during the writing process, and I have no idea how they made it through this even once. Manos: The Hands of Fate feels like a tantric orgasm compared to this. This is an experience that drives anyone who watches it into self-harm and unfettered violence, as evident by the riffs hurled at the screen throughout this episode. I've compiled a supercut of the least inflammatory riffs that feel so genuine and honest that I don't think they could be considered anything but group therapy. A hot shower for the soul, if you will.
I'm sorry about that.
Sure you are.
I am, really.
So, Mike, this is
I
hell.
guess I shouldn't have put the grab on you.
Yes, the devil made this movie for you.
The sad thing is, they're trying to tap dance. Kill me.
I wish I was hanging by that rope.
Yeah, me too.
Looks so good. If I ever get back to Earth, the first thing I do...
See your family?
Nope, I'm gonna hunt down Jerry Warren.
Good.
As I alluded to earlier, this is the first and only, until Hobgoblins, experiment to actually make Servo crack in its final moments. The rage exhibited by Kevin Murphy during the outburst feels so genuine and palpable that it doesn't register as a joke. When you watch it, you want to reach into the television Videodrome style, minus the kinky shit, and embrace the puppet, gently offering reassurances that life is worth living and that there is good in the world, no matter how much of a lie it feels like in that moment.
What a wild, wild world.
Please stay away from sharp instruments for 3 weeks after viewing this film and do not operate heavy equipment. Thank you.
Demolition Man, which we'll cover in our Sylvester Stallone Anti-Film Festival next month, has a brief moment of hideous racism that is so wrong-headed and contemptible that it will at least kill part of your soul. But even if it were extended to the entire runtime of the movie, it couldn't compare to one particular scene in Batwoman. In this scene, the titular, no pun intended, Batwoman is conducting a seance, and the voices of the dead respond in such a manner that if you told me all film and video prints of this movie were destroyed, never to be seen again, I would actually smile. I apologize in advance for what I'm about to play. If it compels you to locate Jerry Warren's grave and defile it, I would gladly join you in an instant.
As it could be highly dangerous.
And highly dull.
Individuals who harbor it may not be aware of its explosive potential.
I'm
afraid I'll have to ask you to repeat the message.
What was it,
It
Eka Mouse?
sounded like Chinese. Emphasize again that it's most important.
Yoko,
You're
no.
speaking in Chinese again. I have to inform you that no one here is familiar with Oriental languages.
Yeah, that's Asian languages, sister.
To us only in English. Do you understand?
Please, God, cut away to anything, please.
I that speaks another tongue.
We know.
Even the trivia for this movie is galling and contemptible. For instance, most of the actresses were cast when the strip club they worked at was raided by the police. The casting director showed up in front of the club as it was being shut down and offered all of them work in the film. Not bad enough? Lead actress Catherine Victor created the Batwoman costume herself because Jerry Warren would not hire a costume designer. She made the bat insignia with a cardboard cutout, outlined it on her chest with a drawing pencil, and filled it in with black eyeliner. And the coup de grace? DC Comics, which owns the character Batman, sued the production company, Associated Distributors Productions, for copyright infringement. Despite the fact that Jerry Warren admits having made the movie only to capitalize on the success of the Batman TV show, he won. No justice, folks. No justice. Because The Wild, Wild World of Batwoman was not feature-length, it was paired with a short to fill the complete runtime of a 92-minute episode of MST3K, and thank God, because without the short, we wouldn't have the host segments, and if we didn't have the host segments, there would only be Batwoman, and that is a world I do not want to live in. The short, Cheating, essentially posits the question, what if the most abusive Catholic diocese bankrolled an industrial film to convince adolescents that if they were to ever cheat on a test, however minor, that their souls would be condemned to hell for eternity? And it was directed by Herc Harvey, who would go on to direct the RiffTrax classic and Criterion Collection staple, Carnival of Souls, which makes absolute sense. As bleak as the short is, it allowed me to take a fun, if not problematic, detour that took me down pleasant memory lane, and washed the thick, grotesque film of Batwoman off my skin, and it all stems from a shot of a telephone.
Did you hear about John Taylor? They voted him out as student council representative because he was caught cheating.
Who? John
What's the
story? Morning Glory.
What's the word?
Hummingbird.
Did you kiss him and cry?
Let's travel back to 1963 and discuss the feature film adaptation of the hit Broadway musical, Bye Bye Birdie. In 1957, Elvis Presley, possibly the most famous man alive, was drafted into the armed forces to America's shock and surprise. By 1960, it had inspired a Broadway musical, and in 1963, Columbia Pictures released their screen adaptation, starring Anne Margaret, Janet Leigh, Paul Lynde, and Dick Van Dyke in his feature film debut. In the film, which deviated from the play in almost every way but the basic structure, rock and roller Conrad Birdie is drafted into the Army, much to the dismay of teenage girls around the country. Van Dyke plays Albert Peterson, a struggling songwriter/advanced biochemist who gets girlfriend and secretary Rosie De Leon, problematically played by the definitively non-Latina Janet Leigh in tan face and brown wig, to convince Ed Sullivan to book Birdie for a farewell performance on his variety show. During this act, he will sing a song that Albert has written and give one lucky girl, picked at random, a kiss following the performance, after which he will ship off for basic training. The random girl ends up being Sweet Apple, Ohio's oldest high schooler, Kim McAfee, played by Anne Margaret, and when Sullivan plans to tape Birdie's broadcast in her hometown, Kim becomes a local celebrity, much to the chagrin of her jealous boyfriend Hugo and her strict father, played by confirmed bachelor Paul Lynde.
I demand respect around here.
It's my hair!
Respect, you hear? Respect!
I respect you, Papa.
I don't want your respect.
In the run-up to the show, Lynde's character obviously tries desperately to keep the rock star from corrupting his daughter. Albert and Rosie go through relationship ups and downs relating to his disapproving mother and their desire to get married, and many a hammy Broadway tune is belted out with glee.
Hi, Nancy. Hi, Ursula. What's the story? Morning glory. What's a tale? Nightingale. Did you hear about Hugo and Kim? Hi, Margie. Hi, Alice. What's a story? Morning glory. What's a word? Hummingbird. Have you heard about Hugo and Kim? Did they really get pinned? Did she kiss him and cry? Did he pin the pin on? Or was he too shy? Well, I heard they got pinned.
Yeah.
I was hoping they would. Now they're living at last.
He's gone.
Going steady for good.
Hello, Mr. Hankel. This is Harvey Johnson. Can I talk to Penelope and...
Is it true about Kim?
Penelope?
I just knew it somehow.
About the prom.
I must call her right up.
Saturday?
I can't talk to you now.
It's a film that doesn't seem to know what it's about, but it's so unabashedly fun and full of charming, quirky performances, especially future MST3K subject Anne Margaret, whose character in the play has a secondary part, but in this film is front and center for most of the runtime. Sidebar. When I was in middle school, it will probably not surprise you to know that I dabbled in musical theater. I was on the technical side because I can neither sing nor dance, and one of the many productions I helped put together was the Milpitas Community Theater's presentation of Bye Birdie. I was in love with the girl who played Kim, who was also the lead singer of my best friend's band, and spent much of my time as prop manager swooning over her. It was almost impossible to watch this film without thinking about her, so even if the movie was absolutely dreadful, I would probably leave with a positive impression, especially since she was even cuter than Anne Margaret. End sidebar. For me, at least, Bye Birdie was a 2-hour blast from the past, racist casting aside, and it made me 2 for 2 in terms of detours worth taking. But don't worry, dear listener, we'll be pulling over into some truly painful excuses for films as the season wears on. As I mentioned earlier, this particular experiment is one of the first, but certainly not the last, to completely sidestep referencing that week's movie in any of the host segments, instead choosing to mine gold from the short on cheating. As to why the writers made this decision, I can only assume that the movie was so nonsensical and repellent that it was hard enough to keep their composure in the theater, much less on the bridge. This is why several Misties I've interacted with have demonstrated utter contempt for this episode, which I understand, but wholeheartedly disagree with, mainly because the segments that we do get are entirely Crow-centric, and present the mischievous bot in all his Groucho Marx-like glory. It all begins when Mike has engaged a group discussion about the short with Servo and Gypsy, as Crow is in the left corner of the frame, bobbing up and down in his own little world.
What do you think about that, Crow?
The Beatles.
You haven't been paying attention at all, have you, Crow?
Yes. could we talk about Mitchell?
I see what I mean.
Hey, I know what let's do. Let's answer the questions that the short posed in our own personal essays.
Oh, sure. That's an excellent idea, Mr. Nelson. That, in and of itself, is a valuable exercise in articulating one's thoughts in a clear, concise manner.
Now, what's in it for us? And by us, I mean me.
Well, there is those hostess snowballs I've been saving.
I also want to be boss of the ship for a month.
Well, we'll talk about that.
And Servo has to do my laundry for a year. Even my underpants.
You don't even wear underpants.
Oh, you don't worry about that. I'll take care of that.
In the next segment, the bots have composed their essays. Servo's is typically pretentious and long-winded compared to Gypsy's typical brevity, which Crow takes advantage of.
Cheating! By me. Cheating is bad. Richard Basehart is good. Well,
great.
Well, that was very good,
Yeah, very
I thought.
nice.
It was
Yeah.
spirited, succinct, very
Right to
nice.
the point.
Great. Yeah. Can't we just hand these in, Mike? I mean, notify me by mail.
No. It's your turn. Now let's hear it. Come on.
Oh. Cheating. Cheating is bad. Richard Basehart is good. So, how about some lunch?
Hey, Crow.
What?
That was word for word the same report that Gypsy just gave.
wow, what are the odds of that happening?
It's not exactly the same. I mean, the read was totally different. My downbeat was on good. Gypsy's was on Richard.
Stone him, cheater! Cheater!
Hey.
The rest of the episode is about Mike trying to determine the proper punishment for Crow. Servo is insistent on murdering him, and Gypsy feels the need to be lenient. That is, until Servo reminds her that Crow plagiarized her paper.
Fry him! Fry him! I want a family dead! I want to burn to the ground!
Yeah, that's a spirit.
Hey.
Crow eventually offers to make a mea culpa, decorated with scores of fake military medals, droning on and deflecting responsibility and mood lighting for a good minute, until Mike reminds him that he never actually bothered to apologize, which he proceeds to do in the most absurd way possible.
In an otherwise selfless and velvet life, I have cheated. And when you cheat, you make an eat out of C and H. I'm sorry.
It's an about-face that only Crow could deliver, and it's a fitting conclusion to one of the most memorable episodes in the show's history. It's also where we end Act 1 of this chapter of the Coolness Chronicles. Next week brings Act 2, when we'll discuss two of the biggest hucksters in the history of cinema, Kathy Ireland's feature film debut, Kurt Russell doing his best Beetlejuice impression, Jack Palance's fake autobiography, and our first run-in with Sylvester Stallone in what may be the most homoerotic buddy cop film ever. And we'll take a trip to a misogynist desert planet known as Gore. All that and much more as we continue to chart the history and legacy of Mystery Science Theater 3000. Thank you to everyone involved in making MST3K for everything that they've contributed to my life and culture as a whole. Double thanks for writing the episode guide that I will quote frequently in this season of the pod. I also want to thank Shout Factory for their excellent supplemental material that was invaluable to my research for this and every episode to follow on this subject. If you want to support the artists who made this wonderful show, many episodes are available on VOD at rifftracks.com. And thank you for listening. If you enjoy what you hear, please rate and review the show on iTunes or your chosen source. Share it with anyone you can, any way you can. This has been the largest and most fulfilling endeavor I've ever seen to completion, and it would be nice to keep making the show until it just isn't fun anymore. Have questions, comments, or random recommendations, or is there anything I missed in this particular chapter? Contact me on Twitter at CoolnessPodRyan or on our Facebook page, and keep on the lookout for updates. Until next week, do what you love, don't be a dick, and as always,
I want you to know Dr. Zhivago is my favorite movie of all time.
The Coolness Chronicles is written, produced, and edited by Ryan Rodriguez. Executive producers are Tracy Rodriguez and Luis Rodriguez. Original music by Bildschirm. Please visit bildschirm.bandcamp.com for more information.